Man, what's going on, everybody? This is the Boxing Source. We are here, and this is one of those impromptu things. Usually, I have one of the instances where you kind of have this midweek report. Usually, do a midweek report or something like that. But um, I I just had to go on live here because looks like some spicy talk has been going on within the lightweight division or something like that, right? So, um, earlier today, man, we had this instance where you got the WBC featherweight champion, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. He kind of laid out a few things in reference to what has been going on, as far as like, him and um, Terrence Crawford, him and Leo Santa Cruz, him and Gervonta Tank Davis, and also him and Devin Haney. Now, on the Boxing Source podcast, we've had Mr. Gary Russell Jr. on, and going back to April of this year, there was something where Devin Haney was talking about Gary Russell Jr. and called him out by his name. And so we have brought it up to Gary Russell Jr. And Gary Russell Jr. was like, look, if you want that smoke, you can get it. I'll come up to 135 and teach you a lesson. Well, there was a lot of talk going on within that particular podcast and the weeks following, but things kind of like dissipated a little bit over the next couple months in reference to that, right? So we didn't really see anything materializing in reference to that particular fight. Um, and then we got this whole thing about Gary Russell Jr. and Terrence Crawford, and the story about Gary Russell Jr. and Terrence Crawford. I mean, this is something that came up soon after they had a podcast with Crawford's trainer Brian Bomac McIntyre. So that had been going on for a couple weeks afterwards. And we had Gary Russell on again, reference to that. So he was willing to say, hey, I'll even go up to 147 to make that particular fight. So that one was something that he felt was personal. So he really wanted to go ahead and get that thing going, right? So within the days and weeks of trying to see if we can get that fight materialized, Gary Russell Jr. was like, hey, man, I done sent the word to Al Heyman, said, look, I want this fight. Let's make this fight. And on the other side, you had Terrence Crawford, still, with an opponent. Well, he was still looking for an opponent, right? They had the date set for him in November. Everything there for ESPN for him to do that. And so all he needed was an opponent. But nothing kind of like came the way of Gary Russell Jr. in reference to that. And kind of seen something in reference to Terrence Crawford having negotiations with Kell Brook. So it looks like Terrence Crawford and Kell Brook will be the ones that are going to be facing each other in November. Okay. So he had earlier today um, on Instagram, right? Yeah, it looks like it was on Instagram. He had Gary Russell Jr. on, and he kind of like went through, fighters that he's been talking about over the past, what has it been about, 5 6 months or more. Because they also talked about Leo Santa Cruz, because we know that Leo Santa Cruz and Gervonta Tank Davis are going to be facing each other in October, right? And both of those guys are, you know, according to Gary, ducking them. You had Tank Davis having his comments, in a in a previous interview, and he kind of like saying that, oh, Gary Russell Jr. don't sell. He won't be able to do this. He won't be able to do that. And in the interview that we had in April, I said, look, if you had a fight between Gary Russell Jr. and Tank Davis here in the DMV, that's a guaranteed sellout. That's a guaranteed sellout. So you can't say that there's no draw, from that particular fight. And the thing is, like, you've had Tank Davis against previous opponents. We fought Yuriorkis Gamboa in Atlanta at the last Saturday of December, and that fight garnered a whole lot of fans in Atlanta. Okay, with someone in Yuriorkis Gamboa, where a lot of people felt like Gamboa is on the tail end of his career, right? So if you have something where people would kind of say that it's a 50-50 fight because Tank Davis and Gary Russell Jr., you know that Gary Russell Jr. is going to be a top shape 100% all day, every day. And with Tank Davis, people have the thing in reference to Tank as far as like him being focused, him, monitoring his weight and all of that. Like, he doesn't really completely put himself or commit himself towards that. So that was like one thing there. But in reference to this thing here with Gary Russell and Devin Haney, Gary Russell says something talking about what happened in the negotiations between him and Devin Haney, where Devin Haney's father, Bill Haney, head trainer for Devin Haney, also is basically the manager. Talk with Gary Russell Jr. and said, hey, we would kind of be interested in making this fight. What would it take to make this fight? And Gary Russell Jr. made it clear what it would be, and they didn't really say nothing about it. That's also those details are also on a previous podcast that we had, and there is a clip within the YouTube channel that talks about what happened between Gary Russell Jr. and Bill Haney at that particular time and why nothing really materialized from that particular point. Okay, now after the end of Gary Russell Jr.'s live on Instagram, he kind of laid down the details as to what it would take for him to fight Devin Haney. And he said it was 1.5 plus a 0.5. 2 million. So it would be 2 million for Gary Russell Jr. to fight Devin Haney. Okay. So now that that has been, kind of like laid out there, here we are, and it's been, I'm checking right now, it's been almost an hour. And it seems like Devin Haney has responded to Gary Russell Jr. And his response is, and it's spicy. The new way of ducking is overpricing yourself. Hashtag stay woke. Wow. So does this mean that Devin Haney feels like Gary Russell Jr. overpriced himself in this potential fight? Now, given that both Gary Russell Jr. and Devin Haney have pulled in fight purses of $1 million at least, right? Now, Gary Russell Jr. against Jojo Diaz pulled in a purse of $1.4 million. for that particular fight. $1.4 million, right? And he's had $1 million purses against, Too Short and Yambire and, the likes of, Kiko Martinez. So he pulls $1 million purses. Devin Haney, in his last fight in November, pulled a purse of $1 million. So, in my view, why would either fighter, I would say either fighter, if you're pulling in $1 million for against fighters that are lower caliber, why would you only increase it to 1.5 for a fight of this magnitude? You would have two champions. One champion that's lightweight, one champion that's a featherweight. I don't see why you can't make it happen like that. So you mean to tell me that whichever party is, not able to get that in? I'm saying that, hey, Eddie Hearn could make that happen. Shoot, Al Heyman could probably make that happen. I would say, look, $4 million purse total, why not? But I don't think it's going to be a $4 million purse. You see, it has to be something in the instance where Gary Russell gets the lion's share. So if he's getting around $2 million, then Devin Haney would get, 1.2 or $1.5 million? So even then, that's $3.2 or $3.5 million purse. So my theory is, if you have $3.2 to $3.5 million for a purse, why not make it happen? Because at this particular juncture, you have people saying that Devin Haney is slated to fight Yuriorkis Gamboa. Okay. Now, we saw what happened with Yuriorkis Gamboa in this fight against Gervonta Tank Davis. There may be people that don't feel like he is, able and ready to go ahead and have a fight of this particular magnitude, and it's interesting because if you think about the timeline with Devin Haney, after he had his fight in November, he had that injury which kind of sidelined him at that particular point. And because of that, the WBC made him the champion in recess. Okay? And when he's a champion in recess, then he'll be sidelined, and then the WBC would have had a fight between the top two contenders for that. At the time, it would have been the vacant WBC title, and then Devin Haney would be able to fight for it. Or it would be Devin Haney coming back, he would be the champ, and he would fight the winner, right? So they were talking about, okay, having Javier Fortuna against Luke Campbell, and then the winner would face Devin Haney. That went out. So then you had the whole thing with Javier Fortuna against Jorge Linares. The WBC gives Devin Haney the WBC title. We know what happened with Jorge Linares. COVID-19 test positive. So that fight has been, basically scrapped. Hasn't been rescheduled. It was supposed to be August 28th. And that fight has been delayed. But you also have the whole thing with Ryan Garcia and Luke Campbell that's being set up. And that fight is kind of lined up to be for the interim WBC title maybe, or being the next in line to fight the WBC lightweight champion. So then that means, where in the world is Devin Haney in this instance or in this picture? I've had a video about that in reference to the lightweight division. You have the whole thing with Vasyl Lomachenko fighting Teofimo Lopez. You have the whole thing with, the Ryan Garcia versus Luke Campbell that's, that was ordered by the WBC. And at the time, you had the whole thing with Javier Fortuna against Jorge Linares, where they had a version of a WBC title that would have been on the line for that. But nothing for Devin Haney. So, after all of that, and now you had the thing where I've pretty much said, look, why not have, Devin Haney fight Gary Russell Jr., right? But now it seems like a whole back and forth is going on between those two guys, and it's like Devin Haney talking about overpricing yourself is ducking a fight. Kind of interesting when word is that there hadn't been any counter offer sent from Devin Haney's team. So we're going to be checking that out, seeing what happens between those two fighters, Gary Russell Jr. and Devin Haney. And once we find out, you'll be sure to we'll be sure to talk about it here on the Boxing Source. Y'all catch us here on this YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe and catch the podcast live Sunday 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. Till then, I'm out. Peace.